Thank you, Provost Dalal, and thank you everybody for coming. I'll keep my comments very brief as well. And I'm going to be talking about reflections on the international community and the role of the international community in the Arab uprisings. So given the short time available, I'll make just a few general comments and then get specifically into a few of the issues, in particular what the UN has been doing in recent weeks. It's always perilous to make definitive statements or conclusions about ongoing and rapidly changing events in international affairs. The more so if there appears to have a clear normative dimension. After all, who here would argue against more democracy in the Arab world? Who would argue that dictators or authoritarian leaders such as Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, or before him Ben Ali in Tunis, or Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, as well as others, should remain and not be challenged? Indeed, as scholars and observers, we cannot place ourselves entirely outside of the unfolding Arab uprisings and civil wars of 2011. Perhaps most importantly, our ability to imagine what can be, I think, is intimately connected to what is actually going on or what we think is going on. There's a clear connection. And I'll say that for me, there have been these two phases in the Arab uprisings. During the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, many of us, both as scholars and perhaps as participants, even from afar, many of us felt a sense of euphoria, a sense of pride that Rami and others have expressed here. In analytical terms, this has been translated in a return to the agency to the people, as a or even the key player in their own self-determination. The international community, we assumed, confronted with this breakthrough and unable to react in a coherent way, would have no choice but to support genuine, bottom-up political and socio-economic reform in the region. And this in turn would lead automatically to a changed or shifted foreign policy, in particular towards Israel, in line with the wishes of the vast majority of the Arab people, as opposed to the regimes that have been supported. This, we hoped, would sweep across the region, taking what some labeled as the Twitter or Facebook revolutions everywhere to clean out the old regimes. This period already feels very far and very far ago, a long time ago. During the next phase of the Arab uprisings, and here we're talking primarily the Libya phase, Bahrain, but also the more recent uprisings in Yemen, even in Jordan and Syria, the initial euphoria has waned, though certainly not disappeared. And it's been replaced with more pragmatism. Here there's a focus on consolidating and institutionalizing modest but important gains rather than thinking in revolutionary or idealistic terms that everything can be changed at once. Still, while recognizing that the situation in the region can never be as it was before, there are, of course, powers, both internal and also within the international community, that have clearly stepped in to influence the outcome in a way that is compatible with their perceived interests. The struggle for control of the international and local outcomes of the Arab uprisings, in other words, has only just begun. Now, in thinking about the role of the international community, clearly the main question to consider, that we all need to consider, is should there be external intervention, and if so, what form should this intervention take? These, of course, are not very easy questions, and a thorough analysis would entail unpacking some of the more obvious imperial impulses inherent in some of the powers, such as France, the United Kingdom, and the US, as well as the battle for regional hegemony between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, on the one hand, and the more complex and interesting questions brought about by an evolving international legal and political order that at once continue to reify state sovereignty, which precludes intervention, while at the same time promote universal values such as human rights and the principle of state responsibility to protect their own citizens, which would encourage intervention. So in a perfect world, of course, the existence of a proactive international community embodied by the United Nations that can construct and implement universal laws and norms against, say, war crimes by individuals and state representatives would be positive. But in reality, power, and specifically the power to define and interpret what and who has committed a crime and what this means to us all, is manifestly uneven. This, in turn, invites generally convincing arguments about double standards and hypocrisy when the international community gets involved in one situation and not in another similar one. No one here needs me to clarify at great length the record, for instance, of the international community and the UN specifically in the question of Palestine, for example. But, and this is the issue that perhaps needs deeper thought in both political and legal, but also ethical terms. Does the existence of a clear record of double standards and hypocrisy within the international community mean that it should never intervene, even in cases where civilians are clearly in imminent danger? We can recall, of course, the tragic events in places like Rwanda, Srebrenica, even the Gaza Strip, where the international community failed to act to see that no facile or easy answer is necessarily available to us. So how did the international community respond to the Arab uprisings so far? Of course, there's no time for me at this point to unpack all the relevant members of the international community here individually, except to say that for their part, the Western states and their key allies in the region, at first, I would say, reacted ambiguously to the uprisings. We can recall, for instance, the French foreign minister going on vacation in Tunis, even as the uprisings had begun. And then when they realized that these were serious social movements, they tried to limit the uncertain outcomes inherent in mass mobilization by supporting the ouster of figures such as Mubarak and Ben Ali in Tunisia, and therefore beginning to align their positions with the Arab people's aspirations, and yet at the same time calling for the replacement with equally grim figures such as Omar Suleiman in the case of Egypt, thus minimizing the possibilities of radical change in domestic and foreign policies. The attachment with the Arab armies as a key institution to preserve stability and thus the status quo in the region was obviously a key factor here. So instead of looking in detail at specific members of the international community, and we can do this during the Q&A, let us look at the action taken by the UN Security Council as the institutional representative of the international community in the areas of international peace and security. My argument here is that the UN is increasingly stepping into murky water, as we're going to see. The UN did not intervene in a meaningful sense in the Arab uprisings until it passed UN Resolution 1970, 1970, on the 26th of February, and then later on Resolution 1973, setting up a no-fly zone in Libya on the 17th of March. So acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, Resolution 1970 demanded an immediate end to the violence and called for steps to fulfill the legitimate demands of the population in Libya. It also decided to refer the situation in Libya to the International Criminal Court. Finally, it decided to impose an arms embargo in Libya, as well as travel ban, the freezing of assets, and a number of other issues like this. In a sense, the passage of this resolution, this is the first resolution to Libya, was made easy by the fact that Colonel Gaddafi was intensely disliked even by his peers in the Arab League, as well as the fact that the Libyan representative to the UN had by then defected and was actually supporting this resolution against his own country. Since this resolution did not call for direct military intervention, it was easy to build consensus in the UN, and the vote was basically passed unanimously by 15 votes to 0, including, by the way, Lebanon, which voted for this resolution. 3 weeks later, on the 17th of March, the UN passed much more controversial resolution, Resolution 1973. This followed, of course, an Arab League decision a few days earlier calling for a no-fly zone, and this was a requirement imposed by the United States in return for support of this UN resolution. Again, acting under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, this resolution, and you can see that it's much more than the earlier resolution, demanded an immediate establishment of a ceasefire and a complete end to violence and all attacks against and abuses of civilians. It authorized member states to take all necessary measures to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack, including Benghazi, which at that point was under imminent attack by Gaddafi, who was slowly gaining against the rebels. While at the same time, this resolution excluded a foreign occupation force of any form on any part of Libyan territory, And I have it on good authority that this was Lebanon's, in particular, this was Lebanon adding this part of the sentence to the resolution to make sure that there could be no way to interpret this resolution as one that could lead to some kind of foreign occupation in the longer term. It also called for establishing a no-fly zone in all of Libyan airspace to protect civilians, as well as to enforce the arms embargo that was already imposed. Now, this resolution, strictly speaking, in legal terms, of course, was legal, because it was passed by the Security Council, and the Security Council is the only body that's authorized to pass such resolutions of military intervention. However, there is also a clear unease on the part of many outside of the most belligerent parties, such in this case, such as the United Kingdom and France, for two main reasons. First, that military solutions, there is apprehension that in general, military solutions can actually solve what basically had become a civil war in Libya. And secondly, that the interpretation of this UN resolution will become increasingly stretched to include moving beyond protecting civilians to supporting the rebels and even targeting the regime itself. Within the confines of the text of this resolution, this would be prohibited. The tension is clearly reflected in the voting patterns of this resolution, whereby the vote in this case was 10 for, 0 against, but 5 abstentions. And those of you that know about the UN will know that this is not a normal voting pattern. So let me put this in a bit of context. The voting record shows that during all of 2011, so far, 8 out of 9 UN Security Council resolutions were passed unanimously. So therefore, this was the only exception, Resolution 1973. In 2010, 51 out of the 57 total UN resolutions that were passed by the Security Council were passed unanimously. 5 had only 1 vote or abstention against, and the only one that had 2 votes against was a resolution that dealt with sanctions against Iran, and here Lebanon actually abstained. So this tension shows that it's not normal. The voting pattern itself was not normal, and shows that there's a lack of consensus in dealing with military intervention in the Arab world. Why is this? Because military intervention has, of course, a long history of failure in the region and in other regions as well. Once such a resolution is passed, a no-fly zone, it becomes quickly apparent that that alone will not bring down the regime. Then the question becomes, well, what happens? How do you bring down the regime if the Gaddafi regime continues to operate even with its wings clipped? There'll be what's called mission creep and further calls for intervention, especially if there's problems with civilian, if there's more increasingly civilian casualties. In Lebanese terms, the last time such a lack of consensus at the Security Council occurred was a passage of UN Resolution 1559, which again was passed by only 9 with 6 abstentions. And the reasoning was quite similar, that it was clearly interpreted as a resolution which was directly interfering within the domestic jurisdiction of one state. Regardless of whether it was right or wrong, there was a clear understanding that the UN at that time had no role to play in directly intervening in a country like Lebanon when there was effectively a civil conflict taking place, rather than some kind of attempt to paint a picture that there was a humanitarian crisis. While these were happening, I said that the only time the UN Security Council actually intervened in Libya was to pass these resolutions, which have become increasingly a sanctioning of military intervention, which I'm arguing is bringing itself into murky water. At the same time, a resolution that was not passed was one dealing with Palestine, and specifically the question of the settlements. So a draft resolution was brought to the Security Council as the uprisings were taking place, and the United States vetoed this draft resolution, although the 14 other members of the Security Council had actually passed it or were supporting it. So in this case, we see that even during the uprisings itself, the fact that we're trying to show in this panel, and we all would say that in the sense that the big dramatic impact that the Arab uprisings have had is that it's now increased the agency of the Arab people in terms of its role both locally but also internationally. But we can see that in the Security Council, it's business as usual. So the opportunity presented to the international community by the Arab uprisings to try and apply international rules and norms equally across all the situations, including in Palestine and Israel, that opportunity was not taken up, at least not yet. So I'd just like to wrap up and conclude by saying that while there is certainly huge changes that have taken place in this region, and my colleagues have detailed some of these, and there is certainly reason to be optimistic. I hope I'm not being too pessimistic. There's plenty of reasons to be optimistic. As I said, primarily because I think the situation will never be as it was of the past 30 or 40 years. In international terms, I think this means that the Arab world and the Arab countries and the Arab people as actual agents of their own self-determination will over time shift the debates in international terms. In other words, the way in which we have to start perceiving and analyzing the international community is not simply in terms of conspiracy of the great powers trying to impose something, but to show that there's also agency locally or in the region to try and impact the way in which decisions in the international community take place. Anybody who followed the situation, certainly in Lebanon, would know this, that when the evolution, let's say, of the Security Council resolutions during the 2006 war went from one stage where there was a Chapter 7 and a sending of multinational forces to one which ended up being Resolution 1701, which was much more balanced, let's say. This was because there was agency on the ground. So it's not one way, it's a two-way street, and this becomes very important in the context of the Arab uprisings. Thank you.